Hello everybody, it's Miss Peachy again from your WCA biology class, and we are doing Unit 8, Lesson 9, Organizing Data About Expressed Traits. So here we are going to be seeing some new terms, which is kind of cool because we haven't seen some new terms in a while. We're also going to see some stuff that you've learned previously kind of work its way back into this lesson, and we're going to kind of connect the dots a little bit, which is kind of a cool thing. So our keywords are distribution, frequency, gene flow, genetic drift, inheritable genetic variation. We've seen that one before, right? Natural selection, founder effect, codominance, and incomplete dominance. All right, so the first thing this lesson talks about is what traits are. That traits are just characteristics of organisms. They are determined by genes and they can vary, right? So the variations in traits are alleles. Well, the variations in traits are caused by different alleles. So alleles are variants or different versions of a gene. So I've talked about these before. This should not be unfamiliar to you if you've been watching my videos, that an allele is just a different version of a gene. So if the gene is for flower color here, the alleles are red or white. And in this case, we talk about simple dominance and recessiveness. So our red allele is dominant and our white allele is recessive. And so this parent has the phenotype of a red flower because the red will always dominate over the white, but the genotype of big R, little r, one red allele and one white allele. We always use the letter of the dominant trait when we're looking at simple dominance inheritance here. So even though white starts with a W, we use little r to represent white. So we're not using two different letters. So the genotype of big R, the genotype of little r, resulting in a white phenotype, resulting in a red phenotype. During meiosis, that means that these will they will separate from each other, right? So the gametes that the red flower can contribute are just the big R or just the little r. The gametes that the white flower can contribute are just the little r. So if we were to cross these two, there's only two possible combinations. Either this guy, big R, is going to combine with a little r and produce this genotype, or these two combine and produce this genotype. So in this specific incident, it's literally a 50-50 shot of whether or not the offspring are going to be red or white, right? So we talked about genotype and phenotype, and this next slide talks about frequency of a trait in a population. So for that example, the frequency was 50-50, 50% red and 50% white. The next term, genetic drift, tells us that there are sometimes changes in the frequency of a particular allele in a population. And with genetic drift, those changes actually result from some random occurrence that has nothing to do with the trait itself. So a good example of that is this picture. In this picture, we see this is our population of beetles. We have several green beetles and a lot of brown beetles. And then some careless person just walks through and stomps on the beetles. What a jerk. But just out of chance, this person tends to kill more green beetles than brown. And so now our population has changed. The frequency of green beetles has gone down. Was it because he had a vendetta against green beetles? He hated green beetles. No, it wasn't because of that. Was it because the green of the beetles made it easier for him to see them? So when he was walking around trying to step on beetles, he stepped on more green ones? No, no, he was just careless. It was completely incidental, completely accidental, completely careless, just random that the green beetles ended up dying more frequently than the brown beetles. This is an example of genetic drift. This is also an example of what we called in a previous lesson something called the bottleneck effect. So a random outside incident reduces drastically the size of a population and ends up either reducing or eliminating alleles. Say he had squished this guy too. He would have eliminated all the green beetles. And so the population now had lost a trait, right? All because of some happenstance outside occurrence that had nothing to do with whether they were brown or green. That's what genetic drift actually is. Another example, and I'm going to kind of scooch up and down here because some of this, I think I like the order less. So, is the founder effect. The founder effect is another example of genetic drift. In this example, a population, a large population, a segment of that large population decides to leave and go someplace else and form a new colony, a new community. And when they do that, they only take a few. And so they have less diversity because they're not taking the full population. So this new population that forms is less diverse than the original population because they were founded from just a few members of the population. So the diversity of the population goes down, meaning that the variation in the population is less, and we see a decrease in the frequency of some traits because it's founded from a smaller group. So this distribution for traits forms a distribution curve. And in large populations, this distribution curve looks often like this. This is very much what we see in big populations. And what they use it as an example is hair color globally, which is a huge population, right? So globally, most people have brown or black hair. So they're represented by the peak of the bell curve. Very few people, only 0.1% and or 1% and 2% have blonde and or red hair. And so they are represented by the ends of this bell curve, right? So most traits we find kind of are following this bell curve. It also talks a little bit about polygenic traits. And polygenic traits are traits that are influenced by genetic material in more than one gene. So not all genes, not all traits are caused by single genes. In fact, I would say most traits are caused by multiple genes. We often just study traits that are caused by individual genes because they're easier to study. Polygenic traits are caused by more than one gene. Examples would include skin color, hair color, and height. These are harder to predict using Punnett squares because um, they're influenced by environmental factors as well, and they're caused by multiple genes, so it just becomes more difficult to study them, which is also why you don't see just short and tall people. You see like a range of height, right? And those you can see in a curve like this as well. And then we talk about natural selection. Now, where genetic drift is caused by random happenstance, changes in allele frequency by random happenstance, natural selection is changes in allele frequency because of those traits. Because of those traits. So, certain traits give organisms a better chance of survival or less of a chance of survival, right? And if those traits give an organism a better chance of survival, they'll tend to be passed on to the next generation more frequently. And we'll see a change in the allele frequency of that trait from generation to generation. This is especially true when we see a new trait arise due to mutations. If it gives that organism a better advantage, we'll see it in the next generation that that trait will occur more frequently than it had occurred in the previous generation. And over time, we'll see more and more of that trait, the beneficial trait, and less of traits that are less beneficial. An example, a fictitious example, would be, say we have um, a rabbit that is white in color, and that rabbit lives in the Arctic, and it's advantageous, right, to be white. We call that um, you know, this is a trait that gives them an increase in their ability to survive. This is we call an adaptation, right? Adaptations are traits that improve your ability to survive. Because guess what? The birds that are flying around, the owls and the eagles and stuff like that, they can't see you very well if you're white. So they're not going to eat you as frequently. So we see a larger increase in white rabbits, right? If the environment changed, got warmer, so now there's no snow cover anymore. Now being white is a disadvantage. So what we would see is those that are white would be easily spotted by predators and eaten, and they won't be able to reproduce and pass that trait on to the next generation. So we'll see an increase in the frequency of brown rabbits and a decrease in the frequency of white rabbits. And generation after generation, those white rabbits become less and less common until maybe they just are gone altogether and that allele no longer exists in that population. That change in frequency of those alleles is driven directly by the trait itself, right? Because one trait is more advantageous and one trait is less advantageous, that is known as natural selection, the process in which organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. And that leads to changes in allele frequency. And it's not random like genetic drift, it is because of the trait that happens. All right, so then the next thing that they talk about in this lesson has to do with certain other types of traits. So we talked about basic dominance and recessiveness. There are other types of inheritance as well. There's a type of inheritance called codominance and a type of inheritance called incomplete dominance. And this is where you do not have one allele that is dominant over the other. In the situation of codominance, both alleles are equally dominant. So normally when we see some organism with regular dominance that has a heterozygous genotype, okay, so that would be like we saw earlier with big R or little r, normally what that would result in is just a red flower, right? In codominance, when you have two of the same, so here we have red fur and white fur are equally dominant. First of all, we don't write it the same way. We write it as big R, big W, because the capital tells us they're dominant. And remember, we always choose the letter of the dominant trait. Well, they're both dominant, so we have two different letters this time. And since they're equally dominant, they express themselves equally as well. The result is a cow with both red and white fur, a combination. That's called codominance. With incomplete dominance, in incomplete dominance, we see neither allele is dominant when both alleles are present. So this is oftentimes called blended dominance, and I kind of like the blended part of it because I think it makes more sense when you call it blended dominance. But blended dominance results in a combination that is in between the two. So if you have somebody with curly hair and somebody with straight hair, then the blend would be wavy hair. So incomplete dominance results in something that's in between. If you have a brown and a white fur, then the incomplete would be a light brown color, a combination, a blend of the two. It wouldn't be spotted like you saw earlier. It would be a mixture. A red and a white flower, a pink flower would be blended or incomplete dominance. Okay. So that is pretty much what's covered in this lesson, ladies and gents. It does go on to talk a little bit more about codominance when it comes to blood type. Blood type is weird because blood type is both codominant and absolute dominance. So you have two alleles that are codominant to each other, and then one allele that's recessive to both of those. So A and B are codominant, O is recessive to everything. So your blood type can be AB, where you have both dominant alleles. It can be AO, that means you're A, type A, because you have the O allele and that's recessive. It can be BO, that's not meaning that you're stinky, but that means you're type B. Or it can be OO, which means that you're completely recessive, right? So it's very different compared to what we've learned about so far, but it is a combination of absolute dominance, because you have these two that are absolutely dominant to that, and codominance. So you're expressing both the A and the B. Remember. All right, that's it for this lesson. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next one.